They sold her the driest, most useless farm in the entire county for $5,500, and everyone said she had been robbed. Within 1 year, that same widow would be turning away buyers offering 50 times that amount. If you have ever been told that something broken cannot be fixed, stay until the end of this story, because what happened on this land will change how you see the ground beneath your own feet. Welcome back to the channel, and if stories about ordinary people finding extraordinary fortune speak to you, make sure you are subscribed, because today's story is one of the most remarkable I have ever had the privilege to tell. Her name was Josephine Caro, and in the late summer of 1878 she buried her husband Thomas beneath a lone cottonwood tree at the edge of 160 acres of cracked, sun-baked Nebraska prairie that had never once, in 15 years of trying, produced a harvest worth speaking of. Thomas had come west with dreams of wheat fields stretching to the horizon, and instead he had spent a decade and a half fighting soil that seemed to reject every seed pressed into it, water that seemed to vanish before it could ever reach a root, and a sky that offered rain so rarely the local almanac had taken to calling the region simply the dry stretch. When the fever took him that July, it took with it the last of his strength to keep pretending that persistence alone could conquer geography. Josephine, 34 years old, and suddenly alone in a country that did not look kindly on widows who tried to keep land instead of selling it, found herself facing a decision that the entire town of Millbrook Crossing believed had already been made for her. The land agent who came to call, a narrow, courteous man named Whitfield Ambrose, made no effort to hide his relief when Josephine agreed to hear an offer. He had expected tears, perhaps even outright refusal, the kind of stubborn, grief-driven attachment that made widows cling to failing farms long after any sensible person would have let go. Instead, he found a woman who listened calmly, asked precise questions about surveys and mineral rights and water access, and negotiated the final price up from $4,000 to $5,500 before she ever signed a single document. Even so, everyone in town agreed she had been cheated. Old Silverton at the feed store told anyone who would listen that the Caro place had killed better farmers than a woman alone could ever hope to be, and that whoever bought it from her would simply be buying 15 years of somebody else's bad luck. Women at the mercantile whispered that she should have taken whatever a decent man in town offered her in marriage, rather than gambling on dirt that had already widowed her once. Josephine heard every one of these whispers and let them pass through her the way wind passes through dry grass, bending it but never breaking it. The man who did buy it, an aging rancher named Bertram Voss, who had spent 3 decades scraping a living from the region and had finally decided he was too old and too tired to keep fighting, seemed almost embarrassed as he shook Josephine's hand at the signing. He had known Thomas. He had watched Thomas dig well after well, only to strike dry rock, or worse, brackish water so mineral-heavy that even the cattle refused it. Bertram was not selling her hope. He was selling her the same defeat that had broken every man who had ever tried to work that ground, and some part of him seemed to feel the weight of that as he folded the payment into his coat pocket and would not quite meet her eyes. He had told his own late wife years earlier that the Caro section was cursed ground, unlucky in a way that had nothing to do with rainfall or seed quality, and some part of him still believed it, even as he took Josephine's money. If you are watching this and you have ever inherited a problem nobody else wanted to solve, I want you to remember Josephine's answer when Bertram asked her, almost apologetically, whether she was certain she wanted to go through with it. "I have buried a husband already, Mr. Voss," she said. "I am not afraid of hard ground." What almost nobody in Millbrook Crossing knew, and what Josephine herself would not discover for months, was that she had not grown up simply as a farmer's wife. Before she had ever met Thomas Carow, Josephine had spent 6 years assisting her father, a hydrological surveyor who had mapped underground water tables for the railroad companies pushing westward across 3 territories. She had grown up reading contour lines the way other children read storybooks, had learned to notice how certain grasses grew greener in patterns that made no visible sense, how certain low places held moisture just a little longer after a rain than the ground around them, how the flight patterns of birds at dusk sometimes traced invisible rivers running beneath solid earth. It was knowledge she had set aside for 15 years of marriage to a man who trusted his own hands and his own instincts over any book learning, however hard-won. Thomas had loved her fiercely, but he had never once asked her to open her father's old journal, believing that a man's own sweat and persistence were the only tools a farm required. Now, alone on 160 acres that the entire county considered cursed, that old knowledge began slowly to wake back up. She did not rush. That is the part of this story people find hardest to believe, so I want to say it plainly. Josephine spent her first full season on the Carow land simply walking it, morning and evening, carrying a battered field journal that had once belonged to her father, and recording what she saw with the patience of someone who understood that the land would eventually tell her its secrets if she was willing to listen long enough. She marked where the wild sunflowers grew taller and denser than anywhere else on the property. She marked a shallow depression near the northeast corner where the cracked soil seemed just slightly less cracked, where a stand of scrub willow had somehow survived 3 consecutive drought years that had killed everything around it. She marked the strange evening flight paths of the swallows that nested in the old barn, watching how they dipped low and consistent over one particular stretch of ground every single dusk, as if something invisible drew them there. She noted the cool patch of earth near the fence line that never seemed to bake as hard as the ground around it, even in the fiercest August heat, and the way morning dew lingered there a full hour longer than anywhere else she walked. By early summer of 1879, her journal held 43 separate observations, and a pattern was beginning to emerge that made her pulse quicken every time she reviewed her notes by lamplight. Lines that had once seemed like scattered curiosities, a patch of green here, a stubborn willow there, a swallow's habit somewhere else, had slowly begun arranging themselves into something that looked unmistakably like the edge of a shape. A shape her father would have recognized instantly, though it would take Josephine many more months to trust her own eyes enough to name it. Her nearest neighbor, a blunt, weathered man named Otis Grunwald, who had farmed the adjoining section for 20 years and had buried 2 wells of his own trying to find reliable water, was not shy about sharing his opinion of her methods. "You're out there counting sunflowers like they owe you money," he told her one afternoon, leaning against her fence post with the particular smugness of a man who believed experience always outranked curiosity. Thomas dug 4 wells on this land and never got anything but dust and regret for his trouble. What makes you think staring at birds is going to change that? I am not staring at birds, Mr. Grunwald, Josephine answered. I am listening to what the land has been trying to say for 15 years. Nobody stayed still long enough to hear it. Otis laughed, not unkindly, and told her he would believe it when he saw it, which was the sort of thing folks in Millbrook Crossing said about most things they expected never to happen. He rode away that afternoon shaking his head and told his own wife over supper that the widow Caro had taken to reading the prairie the way some women read tea leaves. Harmless enough, he supposed, so long as she did not spend herself into ruin chasing shadows. The following month, driven by her mounting confidence in the pattern her journal was revealing, Josephine hired 2 local men to dig a test well at the edge of the willow stand, precisely where her observations suggested the water table might run shallower than anywhere else on the property. It was, by any measure, a significant gamble. She spent nearly $200 of her remaining savings on labor and equipment, money she could not easily replace if the well came back dry, the way every previous attempt on that land had. For 11 days the men dug, through hard-pan clay and then through a layer of stubborn limestone that nearly convinced them to quit. And when they finally struck water on the 12th day, it was brackish, mineral-thick, and nearly undrinkable. The same bitter disappointment that had broken Thomas 4 times before her. One of the diggers, an older man named Purcell, who had helped Thomas on 2 of his own failed attempts, looked at Josephine with something between pity and resignation as he climbed out of the pit, wiping bitter water from his hands onto his trousers. "I am sorry, ma'am," he said. "This ground has always been like this. Some land simply was not meant to give." That night, alone in the farmhouse with the sound of wind pressing against the windows, Josephine allowed herself to cry for the first time since Thomas's funeral. Not for the money lost, though that stung plenty, but for the fear that perhaps Otis Grunwald was right, that perhaps she had spent a year chasing patterns that existed only in her own hopeful imagination, and that the land truly was as barren and unforgiving as everyone insisted it must be. She sat at the kitchen table long after the lamp had burned low, staring at her father's journal as though it might somehow apologize to her for leading her astray. But grief, for Josephine, had never been a place to stay. By morning, she had opened her father's journal again, rereading his notes from years of railroad surveys, and something in his old handwriting caught her attention in a way it never had before. He had written, in the margin of a page describing a survey near the Platte River, a single line she must have read a dozen times without truly seeing it. Bitter water at the surface does not mean bitter water below, for the layers of earth do not always speak with one voice. The idea took hold of her slowly, then all at once. What if the mineral-heavy water they had struck was not the aquifer itself, but merely a shallow, contaminated pocket sitting above something cleaner and deeper? Her father had documented exactly this phenomenon twice in his career, on land where surface conditions misled everyone into believing no usable water existed at all. She spent the following 2 nights poring over every surviving page of his journal, cross-referencing soil types, rock layers, and depth measurements from surveys conducted a decade earlier and hundreds of miles away, searching for anything that resembled the layered clay and limestone her own diggers had cut through at the willow stand. By the second night, she had filled 6 pages of her own with calculations and comparisons, certain, for the first time since the well came in bitter, that she was not chasing shadows after all. Word of her strange, stubborn theory reached the Territorial Agricultural Office by way of Otis Grunwald himself, who, despite his skepticism, could not help mentioning the widow's peculiar bird-watching and sunflower counting to a traveling agricultural inspector passing through on unrelated business. That inspector, a precise, soft-spoken man named Dr. Reginald Hartley, who held a degree in geology from an Eastern university and had spent a professional lifetime being unimpressed by amateur theories about buried water, arrived at the Caro farm expecting to spend an obligatory hour humoring a grieving widow before returning to more serious work. He did not expect to find a field journal containing 15 months of methodical, carefully dated observations that would not have looked out of place in any professional survey. "This is unusually thorough," he admitted, turning pages slowly, his skepticism visibly softening even as his voice remained carefully clinical. "But correlation is not proof, Mrs. Caro. Grass patterns and bird flights can be coincidence. I would need direct evidence before I could tell you anything definitive." "Then let me show you the well," Josephine said. "And let me show you my father's notes on layered aquifers. I believe we struck a shallow, contaminated pocket, not the true water table." Dr. Hartley examined the test well with careful, unhurried attention, took samples of the mineral-heavy water for later analysis, and studied the surrounding soil composition with an expression that had shifted from polite obligation into something closer to genuine curiosity. He crouched at the edge of the pit for nearly 20 minutes, running the exposed clay through his fingers, and asked Josephine question after question about the exact depths at which the diggers had noted changes in soil texture. He left that evening promising nothing beyond a follow-up letter once his analysis was complete. But Josephine noticed, as he packed his instruments back into his buggy, that he asked to borrow her father's journal for a closer study, and that request alone told her more than any words of encouragement could have. The weeks that followed were the hardest of the entire ordeal, harder in some ways than the burying of Thomas, because grief has an ending, but uncertainty does not. Josephine kept walking her land every morning and evening regardless, kept updating her journal, kept watching the swallows trace their strange, consistent path over the willow stand at dusk, refusing to let doubt undo 15 months of patient observation. Some mornings she woke certain she had made a fool of herself in front of a credentialed man from the Territorial Office. Other mornings she woke with a stubborn, quiet certainty that would not leave her, a feeling in her chest that told her the ground beneath the willow stand had more to say than a single bitter well could tell. It was during this waiting period that Bertram Voss, the aging rancher who had sold her the very land she was now fighting to understand, came to call unannounced one afternoon, his hat in his hands and an expression of old, tired guilt on his weathered face. "I heard what you're attempting out here," he said. "I want you to know I never meant to sell you a lie, Mrs. Caro. I believed this land was finished. I believed it the way Thomas believed it, and I am sorry if that belief cost you more than it should have." "You did not sell me a lie, Mr. Voss," Josephine told him gently. "You sold me exactly what you believed to be true. Nobody deceived anybody. Sometimes the truth simply takes longer to surface than we expect it to." Bertram nodded slowly, and something in his shoulders loosened, as though he had been carrying the weight of that unspoken guilt for longer than he had let anyone see. "If you find water on this land," he said quietly, "I would consider it a mercy, knowing that Thomas did not fail because the land was hopeless, only because he did not have the time to find what you are finding." They sat together for a while on the porch that afternoon, not saying much else, and before he left, Bertram told her that he still had Thomas's old survey stakes stored in his barn, markers Thomas had once pounded into the ground years earlier, when he still believed he might find water on his own. He offered to bring them by if she wanted them, and Josephine accepted, understanding without being told that this was Bertram's own quiet way of trying to make peace with the decision he had never stopped second-guessing. 3 weeks later, Dr. Hartley's letter arrived, and Josephine read it standing in her own kitchen, with her hands trembling around the paper. His analysis confirmed exactly what her father's old notes had predicted. The water they had struck was indeed a shallow, mineral-contaminated pocket sitting above a much deeper, cleaner aquifer, one that his geological survey now suggested ran directly beneath the willow stand and continued, based on the very same natural markers Josephine had spent 15 months documenting, toward the low ground near the northeast corner of her property. He recommended, in careful, professional language that still could not fully disguise his own excitement, that she commission a deeper well immediately, drilled past the contaminated layer entirely. This time, when the men returned to dig, Josephine watched every foot of progress with her father's journal open on her lap, cross-referencing depth against his old notes on similar formations. The work was slower this time, more careful, Dr. Hartley himself riding out twice during the dig to inspect the rock layers as they were exposed, comparing them against the survey notes he had studied so closely. At 41 feet, past the layer of bitter mineral water, the drill broke through into something entirely different, a steady, powerful flow of clean, cold water that surged up faster than the men could manage it, flooding the test pit and soaking them all to the knee before they could even react. Otis Grunwald, who had ridden over that same afternoon fully intending to offer more of his blunt skepticism, stood at the edge of the pit in stunned silence, watching clear water pour from ground he had farmed alongside for 2 decades without ever suspecting what lay beneath it. "Well, I will be," he finally said, removing his hat entirely. 15 months of counting sunflowers, and you found what 4 wells and 20 years of my own guessing never did. "The land was never hiding it from you, Mr. Grunwald," Josephine said, laughing for what felt like the first time in over a year. "It was only waiting for somebody patient enough to listen." Dr. Hartley, returning to conduct a full institutional survey once word of the strike reached the territorial office, confirmed that the aquifer beneath the Caro property was not only clean but substantial, likely extending beneath several neighboring farms, including Otis Grunwald's own failed well sites. His official report, filed with the Territorial Land Office, would later describe it as one of the most significant unrecorded water discoveries in the region's recent history, a natural resource that had simply been buried too deep for the crude, shallow digging methods most homesteaders had ever attempted. He personally told Josephine, in a rare departure from his usual clinical tone, that in 20 years of surveying, he had never once seen an amateur observer arrive at a correct hydrological conclusion through pattern alone, without instruments, without formal training, using nothing but patience and a father's old notebook. News of the strike spread through Millbrook Crossing within days, and with it came exactly the kind of attention Josephine had privately feared.
Land speculators and investors from as far away as Omaha began arriving within 2 weeks, some offering staggering sums for the mineral and water rights alone, sums that would have made Josephine wealthier than she had ever imagined being. Sums that would have let her leave the hard prairie behind entirely and never look back. One investor, a smooth-talking man representing a railroad water concern, offered her nearly 40 times what she had originally paid for the entire property, provided she sign over full water rights and allow the land to be developed into a commercial water station for passing rail lines. He arrived in a fine coat, entirely unsuited to prairie dust, spread papers across her kitchen table, and spoke of numbers so large that even Josephine, who had negotiated her own land purchase without flinching, found herself briefly speechless. It would have been the easy choice. Nobody in Millbrook Crossing would have blamed her for taking it. But I want you to think for just a moment about what that offer would have meant for everyone around her, for Otis Grunwald and every other struggling farmer whose land sat atop that same buried aquifer, for the entire dry stretch that had broken so many families before hers. Would selling out to the highest bidder have honored everything those 15 months of patient walking and watching had taught her about this land? Or would it have simply repeated the same old story of quick profit taken at the expense of community, the very story that had already cost this region so much? Josephine declined every speculator's offer, one after another, and instead did something that surprised the entire county far more than the discovery itself had. She invited Otis Grunwald and 4 other neighboring farmers, families who had spent decades fighting the same brutal dry ground she once had, to share access to the aquifer, drilling wells on their own properties, using the same techniques Dr. Hartley had confirmed, splitting the modest costs of proper equipment and expertise among all of them, rather than keeping the fortune locked entirely to herself. She sat with each family individually first, walking their land the same patient way she had walked her own, showing them what signs to look for, teaching them to read the ground the way her father had once taught her. "I did not find this water alone," she told them, at a gathering held right there under the old cottonwood tree where Thomas was buried. "Every one of you fought this same ground for years before I ever arrived. This discovery belongs to all of us who refuse to give up on it." By the following year, the Caro farm and its neighboring properties had transformed entirely. Wheat grew where cracked, hopeless dirt had sat idle for 15 years. Cattle drank freely from wells that had once produced nothing but bitter disappointment. Wildflowers spread across ground that had once cracked open under the summer sun. And children too young to remember the old dry years played in grass their parents had never expected to see grow so tall. Bertram Voss, invited back to see the transformation of the very land he had once sold in defeat, stood beneath the cottonwood tree with tears openly on his weathered face, finally free of the guilt he had carried since the day he signed that deed. "Thomas would have wept to see this," he said quietly. "Not from sorrow, from joy that his ground finally gave what he always believed it could. It gave it
because somebody stayed patient enough to ask the right questions," Josephine replied. "The land was never broken, Mr. Voss. It was only ever waiting." Dr. Hartley, whose institutional survey had brought official recognition to the discovery, would later credit Josephine's methodical, patient observation as equal in rigor to any professional survey he had conducted in his career, an admission that a skeptical, credentialed scientist rarely offers so freely.
He returned twice more over the following 2 years, not for any official survey, but simply, he admitted once, because he found himself curious what else the Widow Caro's patient eyes might notice about the land that trained specialists so often missed. Otis Grunwald, once the loudest voice of doubt in the entire county, became instead the discovery's most enthusiastic champion, telling anyone who would listen that the widow everyone thought had been robbed had instead uncovered a fortune that saved half the dry stretch from ruin. He took to bringing his own grandchildren by the Caro well from time to time, telling them the story of the woman who had listened to sunflowers and birds when everyone else, himself included, had told her she was chasing nothing at all. Josephine Caro never did sell her water rights to any speculator, and she never left the farm that everyone once believed had killed her husband and would surely finish her too. She stayed season after season, walking the same ground each morning and evening with her father's journal tucked under her arm, watching wildflowers bloom in the golden light where cracked earth had once refused to yield anything at all. A living reminder that the most valuable things buried in this world are rarely found by those in a hurry, but always, without exception, by those patient enough to keep asking what the ground beneath them has been trying to say all along. Years later, when new families arrived in Millbrook Crossing, looking to settle on land the old-timers still occasionally called cursed out of habit, it was often Josephine herself, gray now at the temples, but still walking her land at dawn, who would tell them gently that no ground was ever truly hopeless, only unheard, and that if they were willing to be patient, the land would eventually tell them everything they needed to know. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved me researching it, let us know in the comments what part stayed with you the longest. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, now is the perfect moment, because there are so many more stories like Josephine's waiting to be told. Stories about ordinary people who simply refused to stop listening when everyone else had already given up. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.